Good evening, everybody. All together. Much better. Thank you for coming to the fourth of our five lecture series in the 2025 Sacred Trust program, brought to you by the Gettysburg Foundation and by the National Park Service here at Gettysburg National Military Park. Tonight we are breaking with the usual tradition of having one speaker and doubling your pleasure by bringing you two. And this is going to be a very interesting opportunity for us to hear firsthand about some new research, about a new book that's just out, and there's stuff in here that when I first started reading it, my mind began to spin. And when a book like that about Gettysburg and when that happens to me, we're on to something. So let me introduce these folks to you. As the nation's future hung in the balance, the weather gods delivered a wrath of fury on the Union and Confederate forces throughout the Gettysburg Campaign. First, record-breaking heat and humidity wore down the warring armies during ungodly forced marches. Next, relentless storms plagued the soldiers with resultant muddy slogs on nearly impassable roads. The armies met in mortal combat. Soul-crushing heat turned the bucolic fields of Gettysburg into a sanguinary and barren expanse. Finally, torrential rains haunted the Confederate retreat and narrow escape across a swollen Potomac River. Authors Jeffrey J. Harding and Jon M. Nese present firsthand accounts, harrowing narratives, and a groundbreaking meteorological research that reshapes how we view the Civil War's Gettysburg Campaign. Dr. Jon Nese is teaching professor and associate head of the undergraduate programs in the Department of Meteorology and Atmospheric Science at Penn State. We are Penn State. He also oversees weather. See, I told you there would be a friendly audience here tonight. Yeah. He also oversees the Weather and Climate Communications Group in the department, which is responsible for Weather World, the department's long-running television show. In 2015, he won a Mid-Atlantic Emmy for the educational features he writes and produces for the show. Prior to joining Penn State, Dr. Nese was chief meteorologist at the Franklin Institute Science Museum in Philadelphia and an on-air storm analyst at the Weather Channel, where many of us first met him. He has previously co-authored two books, the Philadelphia Area Weather Book, which was awarded the 2005 Louis J. Batten Authors Award from the American Meteorological Society, and a college-level introductory textbook, A World of Weather, Fundamentals of Meteorology, now in its 6th edition. Jeffrey J. Harding currently works as a licensed battlefield guide here at Gettysburg National Military Park. He's also, I heard that woohoo back there. Told you you'd have friends here too, Jeff. He's an independent historian and a leadership consultant as well. Previously, he served 33 years as an intelligence analyst and professional development specialist with the Office of Naval Intelligence. A recipient of the Department of the Navy's Meritorious Civilian Service Medal, Jeffrey was also inducted into the Nimitz Operational Intelligence Center Hall of Fame. He is the author of the highly acclaimed Gettysburg's Lost Love Story, The Ill-Fated Romance of General John Reynolds and Kate Hewitt, and numerous major publications have chronicled his historical sleuthing efforts. He has spoken at many notable events, including a ceremony honoring the 68th anniversary of the end of World War II, held on the battleship Missouri Memorial. He has also been at Gettysburg College's Civil War Institute and now with us at the Gettysburg Foundation Sacred Trust. He has also appeared on numerous television broadcasts and media podcasts. With introductions like that, you know you're in for something very special this evening. So I'm happy to present to you Dr. Jon Nese and Jeff Harding.
Thank you. Well, we'd like to start by thanking all of you for being here. It's truly an honor to be here to do this presentation for you. And we'd like to also, of course, thank many folks. Can't thank everybody that's mentioned in our forward, but we certainly want to mention the superintendent here at the park, Chris Heister. We want to mention Jackie Spanauer, CEO of the Gettysburg Foundation. And then, of course, the coordinators of this big event, Wayne Motz, and I think everybody here knows Wayne. And, of course, coming in his stead recently, Britt Eisenberg has done a great job closing ranks here towards the end, getting everything together. Christopher Gwynn, and, of course, Carol Reardon. Now, Carol, that segues right into our book because Carol kind enough to write our foreword. But not only that, she took extra time and gave us a copy edit. We wore out some red Sharpies in her collection, but we benefited from it, trust me. Dr. Greg Forbes, most of you would know him from the Weather Channel, the storm expert and severe weather. He is here with us this evening. He wrote our afterwards. So Greg, we appreciate him being here. Dale Gallant created some original drawings for our book. So if you look inside your book, you'll see some of those. We thank Greg. John Heiser, real pleasure to have John, good friend for many years, create our maps for the book. And then a number of folks were kind enough to provide really meaningful blurbs. I know some of them are here tonight, and we really appreciate your support of our work. And then finally, History Press. They've been great to work with. Many, many archivists all across the country. Colleagues, my guide colleagues, and you know how that works. Collectors that provide unique and rare photographs for the book, things of that sort. Historians, and most of all, again, you. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, this has been a multi-year, long-distance collaboration. It's invigorating and it's fitting, I think, that both of us are here today. It's the first time we've done this particular presentation. It's actually only the second time we've appeared together and done a presentation. Part of our job today is to convince you why the title of the book and the title of this talk is appropriate. So in terms of figuring out whether you got your money's worth, I think that's where you want to keep your eye.
All right. We thought it would be nice to start with some quotes that many of you that have studied history might be familiar with. These are some of the more prominent quotes that talk about the suffering due to the weather. So we're setting the stage for you, if you will, by providing some of these. Randolph Shotwell, Lieutenant William Wood, 19th Virginia, and then, of course, Brigadier General Jon M. So this is on the march to Gettysburg, June 17th. You'll learn a lot about this in just a minute. Of course, during the battle, Pickett's charge, Longstreet's assault, Pickett, Pettigrew, Trimble, however you prefer to refer to it. The 19th Virginia's there, and of course, Imboden in the retreat. These quotes had meaning, but what we wanted to know is, were they justified? Some would read them and say, well, maybe these are embellished, maybe they're exaggerated, maybe not. Let's find out. Can we corroborate? Can we validate? And can we quantify?
Yeah, Jeff called me in 2018, sort of randomly. He had seen some work that I had done on this topic on the Weather Channel and on Penn State Public Broadcasting. Knowing, of course, many have qualitatively discussed humidity during the battle. No, for example, Robert Crick, Civil War weather in Virginia. But nobody, as best we could tell, and as best Jeff could tell, had tried to quantify what it felt like during the battle. That is, to blend humidity and temperature into, say, a heat index. And he said to me on the phone, I'm often asked, and many are, what did it really feel like? And it's not only historians that want to know about this, but the meteorologists can help in this fashion. And so I'm glad I picked up the phone, because this has been the most satisfying collaboration in my career as a meteorologist.
Well, I'm humbled by that, and I'm elated that he picked up the phone, trust me.
Yeah, I don't always pick up the phone.
So I've been guiding for 26 years, and I'll meet people that haven't gone on a tour, and they say, well, tell me about why I should take a tour. And I say, are you good at puzzles? And they say, what do you mean? I said, well, there's 163,000 troops here, roughly, in the battle. Picture it as a 163,000-piece puzzle. If you think you can build it in 2 hours, please go forth and do it. We study for a lot of years to do this, and it's a privilege and an honor. I can't show you all 163,000 pieces tonight, but we've broken it down into subcategories. And what we want to talk about is the fact that this battle is indeed a puzzle, right? There's different pieces: intelligence, communications, leadership, relationships, logistics, strategy, and tactics. But what about the weather? That's the piece that's been missing. Sure, we've known a little bit, Professor Jacobs and what have you, but there's more to it, and that's what we're about to unfold.
And emphasizing the idea that we're trying to quantify these things. And really, this has turned out to be a forensic analysis. It's a forensic problem, trying to reconstruct the weather conditions. And so we identified a new source of weather information, the Naval Observatory in Washington, D.C., previously underutilized data with more frequent and more detailed observations. We also dug into other observations from places close to Gettysburg, such as Sykesville, Harrisburg, Frederick, places that had not really been used before to look at this problem. Then the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration does more than provide weather forecasts into the future via the National Weather Service. They also have a routine that can rebuild weather of the past. And so we utilize this so-called reanalysis system to reconstruct some weather maps. And then, of course, first-hand accounts also played a role, and they were really the impetus for doing the rest of it.
Absolutely. So here are our maps, courtesy of John Heiser. Thank you. I don't think I saw him in the house tonight, but beautiful maps. We have the approach. You'll see these in the book, The Battle and the Retreat. These are the areas, of course, that we're going to cover as part of the Gettysburg Campaign.
And we really do have, I think, some novel stuff. Just to give you a little tease at the beginning here, the heat wave that affected the armies in the middle of June turned out to be quite historic, even when compared to modern heat waves. The observations that are available from Gettysburg, many of you know that there was a weather observer here in Gettysburg during the battle, but those observations don't tell the full story of the weather conditions. And then after the battle, this rise on the Potomac that delayed Lee's army turned out to be very unusual for that time of year, and we even tried to estimate how much rain must have fallen for the river to get as high as it did. So here's sort of an outline. We'll go through some of our sources and tools. I'm going to do a little Weather 101, but it'll be easy to digest, I promise. And then we'll present some of our key analysis and findings for the whole campaign.
And we just mentioned here, we don't have time, of course, to delve into everything in the book. And of course, we want you to buy the book. But there are some things in here. I'm big on the stories. When you go on a tour with me, and many of my colleagues are like this, we're going to give you the history. It's going to be, accurate, but we're going to provide stories that help you remember what happened here. That's what Lincoln wanted. That's what we want. There are stories in the book of some instances, and that's where we get into the different people's stories and matters to remember when the weather mattered the most. When Sedgwick's corps on a hard march to the battlefield, when Law's brigades coming in from the mountains to try and be here by the time they're needed on July 2nd. So we have these pieces in the book as well. Our sources and tools. And this was where we got into a lot of fun, John and I, because we've got these new primary source observation that no one's really brought to bear on this equation. And so you have the Naval Observatory, which was a wealth of information, and we'll delve into that in great detail in a minute. The Smithsonian Meteorological Project. A lot of folks did not realize that Professor Jacobs here in town is part of the Smithsonian Meteorological Project. That's why he's observant. It's not just because he's a professor. What else did we have? Well, we had these firsthand accounts, and we'll talk about some numbers on that later. But not only firsthand accounts from the soldiers, and there's a plethora, as you might imagine, but we have press accounts. So in Baltimore, they're talking about the weather. In Alexandria, they're talking about the weather. There are reporters with the armies, and then amateur observers. So, speaking of Professor Jacobs, there he is. And I don't know how many of you have ever seen the source document that's often quoted, 87 degrees at 2 p.m. on day 3 of the battle, right? July 3rd, just before Pickett's charge. This is what the primary source document looks like. They observed the weather 3 times a day. So in the morning, in the afternoon, and late evening, and you had those temperatures. You also had rainfall and wind and what have you, but you did not have humidity. And this is what prompted my phone call to John, other than thanking him for the work that I had read that he had already done, is to say, John, I've got this. I finally got a hold of this. Is there anything here, anything that can give me heat index? You wanted to know. Visitors always want to know. My wife's a weather junkie. She wanted to know. And I wanted to know because of all that. And thank goodness, John picked up the phone.
Yeah, and just a little bit of background on the Smithsonian Meteorological Project. Jacobs had actually been an observer in Adams County for a Pennsylvania weather network that was started by the meteorologist at the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia. And when that meteorologist, James Espy, went to Washington, D.C. to team up with the first director of the Smithsonian, his weather observers were invited to become part of the Smithsonian Meteorological Project. Jacobs was part of the network, but there were other observers nearby, but many of them paused during the Civil War. The diagram on the left sort of gives you some sense of where the weather observers were as of 1860. So in the book, we lay out, and I know this looks busy, but it's not really it's not really hard to follow. We lay out some of the observers whose observations we utilized. The table shows some of the locations, the various columns. P is pressure, T is temperature, W is wind, C is clouds, R is rain. So just letting you know who was observing what at the time. The column that I skipped over, the TW, that's the humidity measurement that proved useful. If you look at number 16, Gettysburg, that row is blank. Jacobs did not observe humidity here. Another thing I wanted to point out here, a couple things actually. Look at the dearth of observations to the west there. There's just nothing. Now, we did have observers in Cincinnati, Lexington, Kentucky, Nashville, Tennessee, off the map to the northwest, Marquette, Michigan. So there were others that are not on this chart. But this just gives you some sense of what we used. And another point we wanted to make here, notice Frederick, number 3 over there. Would have been nice to have had Frederick observations during the retreat, but the Frederick observer did not observe in July 1863. We only have observations from June. So back to that source Jeff showed earlier. This is Jacobs' July 1863 observation sheet, and I'm highlighting the column that is available to put a measure of humidity, but it is blank. Okay? Let me zoom in there for you to what it says at the top. A little box will unblurify it for you. That says wet bulb. And this is, and I will explain in a moment what the wet bulb is, but the bottom line is this is the number we need in order to estimate the heat index. We need a measure of humidity to combine with the temperature to come up with the heat index. And this is why nobody had ever tried to estimate the heat index during the battle, because Jacobs didn't make those observations. So, right up the road in Harrisburg, however, there were 2 Smithsonian observers, John Heisley, William Hickok, about 35 miles northeast of Gettysburg. And both of them measured that key humidity variable. And it turns out, using the reconstruction system that I mentioned earlier, we can demonstrate that Harrisburg and Gettysburg were essentially in the same air mass, the same feel of the air during the battle, which was critical in allowing us to make some inferences about what it felt like in Gettysburg.
All right, and we're taking a close-up look at this wet bulb information that we found from Harrisburg. And I can tell you that in communicating with John, I was crestfallen when he first came back and said, well, Jacobs doesn't have what we need. And he says, you got to go back to the grindstone. And I have to thank someone that wasn't on the sheet. She's now retired, Janet Wall, down in Asheville, North Carolina, NCEI. She was the one that gave me entree to the Forts database. Now, most of these weather records are at the National Archives, but the Forts database even has more, and we'll get to that. But the bottom line is, back to the grindstone, and there they were in Harrisburg in all their grandeur and beauty. And William Hickok, that beautiful photo of him, comes from Peter Hickok, the great-great-grandson. And he was here with us at the CWI a couple years ago, unable to be here this evening, but we sure have a debt of gratitude for him for sharing that image with us. Now, talking about forts and what they held for us. So lightning struck twice at Harrisburg. We had Heisley and Hickok, and we were on our way. But then we struck gold. And gold is the observations. You can see the Naval Observatory, they weren't taking observations every 7 hours, 3 times a day. They were observing every 3 hours. Temperature, pressure, wet bulb, which is the key, right? That's the money column. Wind, cloud cover, sun temperature. What in the world is that? That's a temperature a few inches from ground level. Might that not be pertinent to some soldiers that are laying on the ground on July 3rd? Both sides. All right, that's important. Rainfall. And then high temperature, low temperature. We don't have that from the Smithsonian observers, but the Naval Observatory had separate thermometers. Self-registering would give you the high, self-registering a different thermometer below. And there is the observatory sheet in all its grandeur. How beautiful is that? Hairs up on the back of my neck. How about you?
Try transcribing 2 months of that.
Exactly right.
Yeah, but it's all there in red. And I'll have, the sun temperature, the wet bulb, the column, bottom, the maximum and minimum. We'd even get comments. And by the way, this gentleman, Jon Eastman, was the primary observer at the Naval Observatory at that time. We have a little bit biography in the book about him. This is top of the line, state of the art at the time in terms of credibility and weather observations. It's worth mentioning at this time, you may know this, but temperature, as it is officially measured, is measured in the shade. Okay, I'll say that again. Temperature is a shade measurement. And so the temperature column here is a number that is measured in the shade, but they had that special thermometer that was in the sun, which we will use a little bit later. And so, bottom line, if you want to see the entire Gettysburg Campaign laid in front of you, as told by the weather observations at the Naval Observatory in Washington, D.C., there it is. 42 days. High temperature in the first column, low temperature in the second column, our estimate of the maximum heat index in the third column, the amount of daily rainfall. You break it down, you see the heat wave, you see a cloudy-ish cool period leading into the battle, hot during the battle, wet after the battle. By the way, the color coding here helps you interpret whether temperatures were above or below average on those days. And the deepest purple here, those are the super hot days that really stand out. And there's that 4-day heat wave in the middle of June as the armies came north. So yes, this is Washington, and the armies were not in Washington. We understand that. But they were close enough in general that these numbers really tell a very nice story. And then just a little bit more about this NOAA historical reanalysis system. It's a remarkable tool that has been developed by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, part of the Department of Commerce, the same organization that the National Weather Service is part of. This system reconstructs weather maps every 3 hours, three-dimensionally, gives you the best estimate of what the weather map probably looked like going back to 1836. And this was invaluable. It allowed me as a meteorologist to look for, you know your weather maps, right? H's for high pressure, L's for low pressure. They're the storms. That black line, those are fronts. It allowed me to at least get a handle on where the major weather systems were.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about our sources, close out now here with our firsthand accounts. We like to highlight this because we really worked hard on this part of it. We looked at over 1,500 accounts from 250 different sources. We could have done more. I mean, it's crazy what's out there, right? But we just worked and worked and worked, and we wanted as many accounts from every corps that was here. We tried to go to division level, etc., whether it was cavalry, infantry. And so we wanted to know. We looked at civilian diarists, amateur weather observers, and there were a number that had not been used previously, some that had, but we found some extras here. So Marcus Buck out in Front Royal, when the armies were in that vicinity. And he's highlighted in the book because not only is he observing weather, he has a winery out there, has a farm out there, but he loses a son, and cavalry action. And so he writes about this right in the journal where he's providing the weather. And it stopped me in my tracks when I read it. And I thought that needs to be in the book. You'll see that in the book. Press reports, I mentioned the Sun, the Gazette, these type of things.
Yeah, I'm going to give you a quick Weather 101 here, just about how we meteorologists think about humidity. All right? And the variable that was measured still is, but the one that was reported back during the Civil War is called the wet bulb temperature. Based on the principle that evaporation is a cooling process. You know this. Cooling of your body regulated by evaporation of sweat. You step out of the shower, you feel cool. Well, that principle underlies that device right there, which some Smithsonian observers had. It's got two thermometers. The one on the right is a normal thermometer. The one on the left, if you look carefully, there's a muslin sock over the bulb of the thermometer on the left. It was wet, and that made the temperature in the thermometer on the left lower than the temperature of the thermometer on the right. And if you know the difference between the temperature on those two thermometers, you can come up with other important weather variables like relative humidity, which you're probably familiar with, but the meteorologist when it comes to understanding comfort, we're interested in something called the dew point. Because if you know the wet bulb, you can get all this other stuff. And dew point is linked to human comfort. Today's meteorologists on TV are much more comfortable talking about this. 20 years ago, news directors didn't want us to say dew point on television. We're allowed now. As long as we show you a table like the one on the left, which allows you to link human comfort to this measurement called the dew point. And guess what? If you know the dew point and you know the temperature, you can get the heat index. All right? Heat index, National Weather Service charts, very common these days, and they come with classifications and the effect on the body. All right? So you combine the humidity with the temperature to come up with this measure. But there's more. But there's a little bit more here. First of all, we wanted to reinforce heat index, like temperature, is a shade measurement. So you're combining a shade temperature with a measure of humidity. All right, that'll be important with some of our results. Now comes the, but there's more. But wait a minute. Sometimes people are in the sun. Sometimes the wind is blowing. Doesn't that change the way you perceive or feel? What about the angle of the sun? What if the sun's low in the sky as opposed to high in the sky? There's another measure to quantify the way it feels. It's called the wet bulb globe temperature. It's been used for decades by the military and by athletic planners to decide whether it's okay to be outside. And if you're outside, what will the impact be? And what action must be taken under those conditions? And so because the Smithsonian observers often observed, and the Naval Observatory, clouds and wind, and we know the latitude of the various locations, so we know how high the sun is in the sky. You can also compute this measure. And we did that when we felt it was appropriate.
And it's good to keep those recommendations in mind as we start to examine what this measurement is when the troops are on the hard march. You know, what do they tell them? How long should you rest? What kind of hydration? And we know they're not getting any of that. So now we'll get into the teeth of things, the analysis and the major findings, the mid-June heat wave. So significant, what we've discovered there. The new insights about the battle. More details, what we started out wanting in the first place. And then, of course, the rain in the river, which is something that I think with most historians has been a big question. Because what Jacobs measured here in Gettysburg didn't seem to justify what happened at the river and what was occurring in the mountains when the retreat was underway. So there it is, the Gettysburg Campaign, June 10 through 18, 1863. June 15 through 18th, hottest and most oppressive portion of the campaign. Hotter than it was during the battle. Much more akin to what you experienced if you're from this general area or general vicinity a few weeks ago, right? Remember that? 105 heat index, 110 heat index, even worse. And then a historic period of extreme temperatures and heat indices for this area. So we're going to dig down on this.
Yeah, here's what the Naval Observatory told us about that 4-day period. Now, again, we understand these observations come from Washington, D.C., but during this time period, the Union armies were not that far from Washington, D.C. Yes, the Confederates were farther west. Elevation may have trimmed a degree or two off of what they felt. But that kind of heat in June, I looked at the 50-year period from 1872 to 1921 to try to see how often. So a 50-year period following the war, when Washington, D.C. wasn't urbanized, so there wouldn't have been any heating from the city itself. It's very unusual to have a 4-day stretch that hot in June in this area. How unusual? I could only find 3 times when it had happened in the 50-year period from 1872 to 1921. Very unusual. That 117-degree estimated maximum heat index on the 17th, I looked through 60 years of data, hourly data from Dulles and from Washington Reagan, and calculated the heat index every hour. And that's 117 is higher than any value that I could find at either Washington airport in June since 1962. Very unusual to have a heat index that high. And finally, June 17th was mostly sunny. And direct sunlight, according to the National Weather Service, can add 10 to 15 degrees to what it feels like, remembering that the heat index, that's a shade reading. So it could have felt upwards of 130 degrees in the sun. And this was a period of forced marches.
This is heavy marches, 20, 30 miles a day. These guys are on a hard march, trying to catch up with the Confederates, and they're having to deal with this.
And this is a place where that wet bulb globe temperature is valuable, because remember, it comes with recommended actions. And we estimated on this wet bulb globe temperature scale, I know the 91 doesn't sound scary. I'm absolutely convinced that the reason that this has not become a more common measure is because the numbers aren't high enough. The numbers that are really extreme simply don't resonate with most people. But these are the impacts and those are the actions associated with a wet bulb globe temperature of that value. This was on June 17th.
Yeah, and so the 18th, the heat wave is going to end, and finally, typically, we're all used to this, a big storm's going to come through. It's exactly what happened. And this is, again, go back to the beauty of these reports from the observatory, because you can see that the temperature's dropping from 97.5 to 85. Now, you might not have seen 97 here, but they had this self-registering thermometer that tells you it's 97.5. And then they happen to go ahead and make some notes. Again, this is Jon Eastman. Don't know if you recognize the name, but there's a wonderful write-up in the book about him. We learned a lot about it, and we're so impressed. And we were quite fortunate that he was the guy making the recordings at this time for the observatory, taking the recording, excuse me. So considerable hail. We go back to our accounts from the soldiers. What are they talking about? Hail. They're in the midst of it. Even the press in Baltimore talking about a terrific hailstorm. So this is, of course, validating that for us. All right, and we're back to the quotes. Back to the quotes. So now these resonate a little more for us, don't they? Is there any question about this being accurate, what these guys are saying? Holy smoke. How in the world did they endure it? That's what I wonder. And some didn't. Sadly, many will pass away. Many will pass away. All right, so there's our key findings. We've shifted gears now. We're here in Gettysburg. And the rest of the campaign, of course, the approach to Gettysburg is covered in detail in the book, but we wanted to jump to the battle for you tonight and get right to it. So there's our key findings right up front for you. The heat and humidity on July 2nd. All right, Jacobs had said 81. People asked me on July 2nd, when Sedgwick's marching to Gettysburg, when Laws was coming in, what's the weather? 81? Wow, not too bad. We can deal with 81. Well, wait a minute. What about the heat index? What was the sun doing? Was there any breeze, etc.? And we found it's much worse, much worse. And July 3rd, of course, and we revealed some of this a couple of years ago at the CWI, Civil War Institute. But we've gone a little further this time, looking at the ground temperature and kind of taking a close focus on what we call the time of maximum discomfort.
Yeah, and so humor me just a little bit here. This is the key place where I realized that this National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration reanalysis system could be valuable in this project. When you reconstruct the weather maps, and this is the standard map you might see on the evening news, with the areas of high pressure represented by H, low pressure represented by L, and cold fronts and warm fronts drawn with fancy blue and red lines. I just used black lines, okay? But the bottom line is, the reason the NOAA reanalysis system was valuable with the battle is because when a meteorologist looks at these 4 weather maps from July 1 through 4, you recognize immediately that both Harrisburg and Gettysburg were essentially under the control of the same weather systems. Whether you were in Gettysburg or whether you were in Harrisburg, it would have felt the same. And so this allowed me to reasonably state what Jeff was essentially asking for. Yeah. How do we get at the heat index in Gettysburg? Well, we can use the humidity data from Harrisburg, project it onto Gettysburg, and feel like that provides us with reasonable answers. So we're going to just take you through together sort of what was previously known about the weather of July 2nd, which was basically, as Jeff said,
81.
81. So what else do we know? What's the rest of the story? So we can paint some temperatures. We know what the temperatures were in some other places. That can be useful. But now we can overlay the humidity, the dew points. All right? And all we did, was I translated the dew point number from Harrisburg to Gettysburg. Very reasonable. That value of dew point falls in the very humid and uncomfortable category if you look at the dew point table. Okay? So that's where those words come from. So now we do.
Yeah, there's your heat index. 2 p.m. heat index.
Right. But that's at 2 p.m. Now we know that generally speaking, 2 p.m. is not the hottest time of the day. So it would be reasonable to assume the temperature and the heat index went up a few degrees by late afternoon. And by the way, that heat index is associated with those words. Those are the words from the National Weather Service heat index chart. So now we look at the time of maximum discomfort.
Absolutely.
Later in the afternoon.
Later in the afternoon, which is, of course, a key time of the battle, right? Doesn't start till 4 p.m. on July 2nd.
Now, Jacobs told us about the cloud cover, but he also told us what kind of clouds they were. They were the thin ones, the ones when you look up, you still can't look directly at the sun. Because these clouds, cirrostratus clouds, let a lot of sunshine through. So the sun, again, can add 10 to 15 degrees to what it feels like. And so now, all of a sudden, at the time of maximum discomfort, you graduate to another level of potential heat index.
Absolutely.
And those words are taken from the heat index chart associated with those numbers.
And we go right back to the sun. The sun can add 10 to 15. Is that amazing?
So it turns out to be a much more stressful day on the human body than was suggested by the number that has previously been generally used to characterize the day.
Exactly, John.
So now I'll let Jeff take you through July 3rd in the same sort of...
Same situation. So we knew 87 degrees at 2 p.m., thanks to Professor Jacobs, and that's often quoted. And there are the other sites we're looking at. Naval Observatory, interestingly enough, 87 degrees. Remember that they measured that at 2 p.m. too. We're going to come back to something with the ground temperatures later on that. But Sykesville, Harrisburg, all right? And now we've got a dew point. And that's getting up there. You remember those faces. And the face at 76 dew point, not happy. Not a happy face. Not a happy face at all. But again, 2 p.m., we know it's oppressive.
And so we can do the 2 p.m. heat index, 98.
98, and that's really a minimum. And John, you know, this is a dance between us, right? And he keeps me reined in. And I say, boy, is it this bad? He says, well, wait a minute. You know, I'm a scientist here. Listen. So this is conservative, right? This is conservative.
Right, so now, time of maximum discomfort, we add a couple degrees to that, very reasonable. And by the way, we talk about this a little bit in the book, but this battle is being fought in a place where there's vegetation growing. And it's well known that plants transpire and can actually add a little bit of moisture to the air. And so it would not be at all surprising for the dew point, this measure of moisture in the air, to be a little bit higher in the place where the battle is being fought. So Jacobs wrote 40% cloudy. Now, there were different type of clouds that day which let less sunshine through, but we still know what the sun can add. So conservatively, that is our estimate of the heat index. And now all of a sudden the words on the impact scale change to that.
And the bottom line is that's quite a bit different, I think you all agree, than the 87. The 87 that we've always believed, but we're uncertain of the rest of the story. And now we have it. Now we have it.
And there's one more point we'd like to make, utilizing the data from the Naval Observatory. Jeff talked about this a little bit earlier. They have a column on their observations called sun. And this is a thermometer placed a couple inches above the ground in the sun. All right? And now you might say, well, this is at the Naval Observatory. The battle was fought, Gettysburg, not in the same place. But guess what? At the time of Pickett's charge that afternoon, the temperature at the Naval Observatory and the temperature that Jacobs measured at 2 p.m. in Gettysburg were the same, 87. And the cloud cover in Gettysburg and the Naval Observatory was pretty much the same. And so when you zoom into the number at 3 o'clock in the afternoon for that sun temperature, that's the number right there. Again, this is a couple inches above the ground, thermometer in the sun. Okay? Now you might, this gets us back to
exactly this. And again, can we corroborate? Can we validate? Can we quantify? And we believe we've done this, and maybe a little more. Because there are probably guys that didn't make it that couldn't comment on it. But these that we have, some amazing commentary from the guys that were out there. Speak for themselves, these comments. And of course, there's many instances of this. So the retreat, and we had a lot of fun with the retreat. We wanted to look at something that hadn't been looked at in detail, and there are books out there that delve deeply into the retreat and give great information and cover the weather extensively. So what could we bring to the fore that was something different? So here we go with M. Bodden again, and I mean, there's really no better description, I think, of what's going on when the retreat begins. Certainly it speaks volumes, what he had to say. And then Norval Baker here, 18th Virginia Cav, talks about it as well, what they're encountering on the retreat over the mountains. And then even on the 6th of July, they're talking about how bad the rain was coming down. So it didn't seem to wash, if you pardon the pun, not intentional, with what Jacobs had measured in terms of rain. And we're going to take a look at that now.
And this kind of summarizes what we know weather-wise about the retreat. There are no official observations in the area of the retreat south and west of Gettysburg. There simply aren't.
And John, just let me mention real quick, there were 3 observers that could have greatly helped us, right? There's one in Winchester, there's one in Chambersburg, and there's one in Leitersburg. And if you don't know where that is, it's right by Hagerstown, which is, of course, not far from Williamsburg, where Lee can't cross the river. So where are those observations? Well, there are none to be had. None of them were observing at the time. Thankfully, the one in Chambersburg did keep a diary, and we used his diary for some of his accounts. But
we know what the soldiers said, and we know that the river at Williamsport was high enough, reasonable estimate 15 to 20 feet, that at maximum to prevent Lee from crossing.
Absolutely.
We know that a generally dry period set in. From the 9th to the 12th, the river fell, and then rain began again, and time was of the essence. So Jeff would impress upon me, there's still a lot of question about how much rain fell during the retreat in the area upstream of Williamsport, where there are no observations. Now, the numbers you see on the screen there are numbers we dug up. The Gettysburg number was well known. That's how much rain fell in Gettysburg during that period. The other numbers, this is the first time, as far as I know, other than the book, that they've been shown publicly from some of the other observers. It would have been really nice to have an observation from Frederick, Maryland, but we don't. But could we say anything about this? And Jeff, here's your opportunity to say a little more about it. Yeah.
This is where I'm going to ask for your help, right?
Yeah.
Because you're here, and most of you love history. We did find that the weather observer from Leitersburg was keeping records, actually. He just wasn't submitting any to the Smithsonian at that time, or they didn't make it there because of all the armies being around. But this is an article from an 1865 January newspaper out of Hagerstown, where he is discussing the rainfall in 1864, month by month. And then 1863 is detailed down here, but only for the entire year. You can see there's a lot more rain in 1863 than there was in 64. But my gosh, where's the monthly breakdown? We need July. We need July of 1863. And trust me, I searched far and wide, have been unable to unsurface those records. Here's a little clue though. Jacob Bell is married to Julia Jacobs. Anna Jacobs, excuse me. Anna Jacobs, and this is Professor Jacobs' sister. So there's a connection there, right? There's a nexus. Could the records have ended up when Jacob Bell passed with the Jacobs family? That hasn't panned out yet. But again, I'm back to you, because some of you like to research, right? We've got to find those records if they're out there. I'd like to see it.
Yeah, it would have been really nice to have a number there. So what do you do to try to add something new here? So I got to thinking, why don't we just look for some recent times when the river at Williamsport rose to approximately the level that we think it was in those early days of July 1863. And the National Weather Service was very kind to supply us with data from Williamsport. So I found 3 current times when the river got to between 15 and 20 feet at Williamsport. And I simply asked how much rain fell to create that river rise. And so I know there's a lot of data plotted on here, but we've identified where Williamsport is. And there's actually not a lot of data in the basin that drains into the Potomac that eventually goes past Williamsport, but there's enough there. And I want to point out, you may say, well, you don't have any, none of these are from July. Why didn't you find events in July? And we had data going back to 1996, so almost 30 years worth of data. Why didn't I use any July events here? And the reason is because there were none. In other words, in the last 30 years, the river at Williamsport in the month of July has not gotten to the level that it reached, or we think it reached, in July of 1863. But you put these numbers together and you can come up with a reasonable answer, a reasonable estimate for how much rain is necessary in that basin that then drains into the Potomac, which then flows past Williamsport. And it's of order 3 to 4 inches. It's a reasonable guess based on modern analogs.
Our reverse engineering, we kept referring to.
Yeah.
So we're back to in their words. And so can we add to this now in terms of the validity, the tremendous rains quoted by Imboden when he first arrives on the 5th. And then the 8th, it's raining again. You know, they're hoping to get across the river. And they're in trouble again. Julius Lineback and his family was very generous. You'll see in the book an image from the actual diary. And it's about that big. We have it next to a pencil, so you can see these guys are keeping these records. Thank goodness they kept those kind of records for us. So on the retreat, this is what General Lee's army would hope to have found at Williamsport. This is what they were looking to find, in other words. There's no boat ramp there for Lee at the time. These are modern photographs in living color. But this is where the modern bridge is crossing. Take a look at those abutments for the bridge. Take a look at the river. This is what they wanted. John? This is what they found. This is an event on the river when we know it was between the 15 to 20 foot range. Fortunately, some wonderful historians in the Williamsport area cued us in to the availability of the chance to get these pictures. John, one more series here. This is adjacent to the location you were just looking at. So to the left of the boat ramp, you can see. Again, they would have preferred this, 2-3 feet deep, 4 at the most. Yeah, that's what they found. We've got a little side-by-side for you, too. So you can see. November 24, 2 to 3 feet deep the river was, and there it is, cresting between 15 and 20. Little time travel for you. I think that's how we titled it in the book.
And so we hope, first of all, that we've tried to convince you why we used to title the book the way we did, The Weather Gods Curse the Gettysburg Campaign. But we hope we've provided the first ever day-by-day account of the weather for the entire Gettysburg Campaign. We didn't go through all of it here. A historically intense heat wave, discomfort during the battle, now better described by layering on humidity, sunshine.
Heat index, all of it.
And then finally, hoping at adding a little bit to the knowledge about the rise of the Potomac, how unusual it was for July, what it looked like, perhaps, and approximately how much rain was necessary to make that happen.
Yeah,
So really an honor and a pleasure to be here today. I want to thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Indeed. Thank you very much. Thank you.